Welcome back to The Bandit of Ashley Downs by Dave and Netta Jackson. Chapter 11, Leaving. By now, Curly had saved nearly £2, and he figured that it would be enough to get him back to London. He had no idea how much a ticket would cost to travel by public coach, but he would ride as far as possible and walk the remaining miles. At midnight, nearly a year after he'd come to Ashley Downs, Curly crept out of his dorm room and hurried down the lane toward the large gates of Ashley Downs. It was cold and dark, but not completely black. The moon was behind the clouds. When Curly reached the gates, they were locked. No problem. He quickly hauled himself up and over the top and was climbing down the outside when a voice said, "Well, well. And where are you headed this late, young man?" Curly froze, clinging to the gate. It was Mr. Muller's familiar voice. "Nowhere," grunted Curly, not knowing how else to answer. "Certainly you weren't coming out on a night like this to escort me home from town. Come on down here and show me who you are." Curly dropped to the ground, realizing for a second time that Mr. Muller had caught him. But he could escape by running if he wanted to. Instead, he turned and faced the old man. "It's too dark for me to make out who you are, so speak up and give me your name." "No sense lying. It's me, sir, Curly Roddy." "So, what are you up to? Do you have a friend somewhere you are wanting to visit, Mr. Roddy?" "No, sir." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm leaving, sir." "Leaving? You don't like it here at Ashley Downs?" Muller made no move to stop Curly as he got out a key and unlocked the gate. Curly swallowed. "It's not that, sir. I just want to make my way on my own." "Well, as I recall, you've tried that before, so you know what you're in for. I can't imagine that living on the streets is better than living here. But if you want to go, you can go. This isn't a prison, you know. You can leave during the day, and in your own clothes, I might add. That is an orphanage uniform you have on there, isn't it?" Curly looked down at the blue coat and brown pants. "Yes, sir. I didn't mean to be stealing it." "I should hope not. But it's yours. You can wear it if you want to. However, your street clothes might suit you better in the outside world. Why don't you come on with me and spend the night? Tomorrow you can get your old clothes, enjoy a good breakfast, and leave by daylight." Mr. Muller went on through the gate and held it open for Curly. Curly stood there debating with himself whether he should wait till morning or leave right then. For some reason, he believed Mr. Muller, that he would be free to leave in the morning if he wanted to. The old man had never deceived him. And yet, going back felt like giving up. He had saved and planned so long. But Muller was standing there with the gate open, waiting for him. With a sigh, Curly went back through the gate and followed Muller to the dorm. "You run on up to bed now, and don't tell anyone about our little adventure tonight. In the morning, if you still want to go, come see me. Good night now. I have some hard praying to do." Curly didn't say anything. He was afraid that Mr. Muller's hard praying might be for God to keep him from leaving. And since God answered George Muller's prayers so often, that was scary. But Curly was determined to let nothing stop him. The next morning he went immediately to George Muller's quarters and knocked on his door. "Well," said the kind old man. "I want to leave," said Curly. "I thought as much, so I had Mrs. Bentley get your old clothes out of storage. They don't look too shabby." Mr. Muller eyed Curly in a way that made the boy think that he knew that the clothes had been purchased with stolen money. Curly took the clothes, suddenly feeling very guilty. "See you at breakfast," Mr. Mueller said as Curly hurried back down the hall. He decided that he wouldn't put on his street clothes until after breakfast. It would save him from having to explain to everyone what he was doing. After breakfast, Mr. Mueller called Curly forward. "Oh, no," thought Curly. "What's he doing? Is he going to punish me in front of the whole house?" But he got out of his seat and walked to where Mr. Mueller stood. "Children," said Mr. Mueller, "you all know Curly Roddy. He's been with us for nearly a year, but today he's going to be leaving us. We are going to miss you, Curly, and we want you to know that you are always welcome here. But before you go, we want to pray with you." He put his hand on Curly's head and then began. "Dear Father, you love Curly even more than I can love him. And so I ask you to care for him wherever he goes and in whatever he does. Protect him from sin and sickness and provide what he needs." Curly couldn't believe how sincerely the old man was praying. George Mueller wasn't trying to convince him not to leave. He was blessing him, praying for the best for him. The boy was so surprised that he opened his eyes and looked up at Mueller. Large tears were streaming down the man's wrinkled face as he prayed. And suddenly Curly realized that he was loved, really loved, by someone. It was the biggest shock of his life. The boy didn't even hear the rest of the prayer. Instead, all he could hear running through his mind were Mueller's words about God being a loving father. If I had a real father like Mr. Mueller, Curly thought, then maybe I could believe that God was a loving father too. It didn't occur to Curly that in the loving care of George Mueller, God had provided him with a loving earthly father. But he was walking away from that gift. Suddenly the prayer was over and Curly was surprised when Mueller gave him a big hug. "Let's give Curly a cheer," he suggested. The whole dining room erupted with hip hip hurrah, hip hip hurrah, hip hip hurrah. Curly walked away from Ashley Downs that morning with strange, conflicting feelings. On the one hand, he felt free, headed for adventure. After living on the streets for 6 years, all that schoolwork and kitchen duty and bedtimes at the orphanage had felt very confining. On the other hand, Ashley Downs was the only home he'd known for years, even more pleasant than his childhood. He'd made some good friends, and he had to admit it, they were people who loved him. But then he thought of the stash of money just waiting for him behind that loose rock in the warehouse. £1,500, minus whatever Spuds managed to spend before the police came. Why, with that much money, he wouldn't have to pray and wait and wonder whether God was going to answer his prayers like he answered Mr. Mueller's. Pushing down the guilty feelings that nagged at him for planning to keep the orphanage's money, Curly kept on walking.